Characters are the paradigm for making any sort of fiction work. A mediocre story can manage to be saved and raised even higher by having an incredibly likable cast. Any story would want to make sure you at least like the characters you're forced to watch the entire time. Doubly so, the villains also have to have a similar sort of draw. Something that attaches you to them and you want to see play out. Everything leads up to the proper setup, climax, and resolution, understanding just why everything played out as it did. But when it comes to RWBY, it has a real hard time accomplishing these steps. More often than not, instead of seeing the characters rise up to other levels, you're seeing these others torn down. They're made to look bad so the heroes can look good. It's not just happened once or twice, it's happened over and over again, and it's a consistent problem with how disrespectful this series is to its own characters. It's like they only want you to like Team RWBY and no one else, so anytime any characters get in their way, they become a problem, and Team RWBY bulldoze over them with utter disregard for their storyline. When the series focuses every ounce of their effort on only the main characters, it leads to others missing out on the opportunity to become fleshed out themselves, giving vague misrepresentations of who they are to the audience and to itself. And I think no one more so has suffered this fate than Raven Branwen, Crow's sister and Yang's mother. I believe she single-handedly is the most misunderstood character RWBY has created to date. More so than any antagonist's righteous revolutions or protagonist's immortal lifespan. By both the characters as well as the audience, there's an inescapable bubble Raven finds herself specifically placed into, which she's not allowed to exist out of. The perception that she's a coward, lacks love, and cares for nothing other than herself. Not a single soul even humors the idea that she's anything else. And it's that exact outlook towards her which uniquely enough creates a very intriguing character. What exactly happened which led to the point of Raven Branwen being so hated, so negatively seen, so misunderstood? Now, before we chalk everything up to the writers and directors failing at yet another character, it's important to see that it's not just how she was represented. In fact, the Raven everyone associates her with being now is actually much different than when it began. To understand her, we must first go through with how the show was initially treating her before things began to change. Raven's introduction was anything but. We never actually got to see her, rather she was a figure who existed through word of mouth. Yang Xiaolong, being one of the main characters of this franchise, would frequently speak of the mother she never had, growing up under a household with her father, his new wife Summer Rose, and later a younger sister. She grew up with a mother figure, but not her actual mother, leaving her to question why she never stuck around. Fully aware she was alive somewhere in the world, it almost became her sole mission in life to understand one simple question: why? This served Yang's initial setup quite well. Every character needs some sort of event from their past in order to drive them to want to accomplish some greater goal, personal or not. It was made clear from the get-go that the search for her mother was what was pushing her forward, as in her debut trailer, she makes her way to Junior's club to see if he has information on her. While the smaller detail is easily missed by many caught up in the spectacle of the action that precedes it, it was later confirmed by the creators and the writers that the picture Yang shows to Junior is indeed of her mother. Doubly so, this was also her introduction as well, as a Raven can be spotted spying on Yang before she ever even entered the club. This all was of course before we even knew anything about either of these two characters, yet they were both introduced at the same time. As the series went on, we got to know more about Yang's search for her mother.
But I learned that the two of them had been on a team together with Summer and Crow, and that she'd left me with him just after I was born.
Why did she leave you?
That question. Why? I didn't know the answer, but I was determined to find out. It was all I thought about. I would ask anybody I could what they knew about her.
It was clear that as an audience member, you immediately sympathized with Yang. as the abandonment of a parent is a rough part of anyone's life to have to deal with. But you didn't hate Raven because of this, simply due to one fact: Yang didn't either. The way Yang speaks of her endless journey to find out the truth doesn't stem from anger and hatred towards her, but curiosity and sadness.
I didn't know the answer, but I was determined to find out. It was all I thought about.
As a viewer, you feed off the same energy the characters usually do. If Yang isn't getting upset over it, why would we? All she wanted was answers. And answers we almost got. Not too long after this conversation, a mere 5 episodes later in the same volume, they chose to include a physical appearance by Raven in the episode No Breaks. After a devastating loss on the part of Yang against her fight with Neo, she is left unconscious and vulnerable, about to be killed. But before that happens, Raven steps in to save her. After her daughter is no longer in harm's way, she swiftly attempts to make her exit, but not before a dazed Yang catches a glimpse. Yet again, at the time of the episode's release, no one knew this was Raven, though after this happened, it was definitely the biggest theory. And finally, at the very end of the volume, there was a post-credits scene, where it had her confronting Yang.
Who are you?
Yang, we have a lot to talk about.
It was confirmed later that this was in fact Raven. This left on the cliffhanger an expectation that these two were about to have a conversation discussing who she really was, unfortunately off screen though. This was a very controversial decision behind the scenes. Lots of effort went in to try and get this cut out from the final product, but Monty put it in anyway. At the end of the day, it was his vision. The story between Raven and Yang was undeniably moving much quicker than fans would have liked, as despite the seeds that were planted back in the Yellow trailer, Volume 2 was really when we first learned of Yang's motivation to find her. So to keep that supposed mystery for all of about 5 episodes was really off pace. But little did we know we wouldn't have to worry about the pacing of their story, because it was all about to change. The post-credits scene would go on to get retconned, and it's quite clear as to why. Much like many characters who fell victim to a story that didn't know where it was going, Raven found herself caught in the mix of a transition period for the series. In between the events of Volume 2 and 3, the idea for the Maidens were thought up. 4 girls who control the powers of the seasons and were the keys to gaining the relics of each academy. And its concept was put in effect immediately in its next season of Volume 3. The series creator Monty Oum also died, leaving character directions he had in mind to be lost. Considering just how muted of a role she'd played so far, Raven's story was likely the victim of being forgotten. The scene of confronting Yang was retconned and pretended like it never happened when the new volume came around. After pushing so hard to not get it included in the first place, now that Monty was no longer there, they could just pretend like it never happened. While many believe the entire scene was a dream sequence to begin with, taking place on the part of Yang, too many things about it are still off. Even if this were just a dream Yang was having, the first problem arises due to the fact that she has no idea what her mother looks like in modern day. A clear and concise image of the woman she actually is much too detailed to be just a figment of her imagination. Also, her line of having a lot to talk about. What could she possibly be referring to if this is all taking part on behalf of Yang? Raven can't tell her anything she doesn't already know. And even if this were in a sort of dreamlike world, with this being the real Raven taking part, this whole thing is never brought up or mentioned again. So it's much simpler not to pretend as though they just never brought it up, rather they retconned the whole thing and acted as though it never happened. And by getting rid of this brief scene, it fundamentally changes everything it represented. A lifelong search for the mother that left her shortly after her birth approaches her instead of having to be found. with a smile on her face nonetheless. This, alongside a mysterious concept for a battle between Raven and Team Juniper, was also scrapped for Volume 3, unknown what even the premise was for. Many have speculated that it was due to the fact that Pyrrha was to become a maiden and Raven attacked her seeking to get its powers, but considering just how new the premise of the maidens were, it doesn't quite make sense that they had not only determined that Raven was to be one of these supposed maidens, but also she was on a journey to kill Pyrrha because of it. None of it quite added up with the story she was already given. This is such a huge concept that for it not only to have not happened in the season, but also not having Raven make a physical human appearance at all in the volume, is just too big of a plot point to simply brush under the rug. Mention of Raven would not cease to exist in Volume 3, however, as Crow speaks to Yang about her. Much like many things Volume 3 manages to accomplish, it somehow splits the character of Raven into two, what she was initially set up as in the past volumes, and the character they were beginning to make her. As would be a common talking point when discussing her, Raven is described as complicated. By Crow's own admission, he paints her out as someone who's a bit of a loner. She doesn't conversate much and prefers to be alone, but at the same time reconnecting every now and then. Admittedly, it's not that bad of a picture he's painting her out as, and nothing is inherently wrong with being how he described her.
I saw my mom, and I thought I saw her. Her sword. Like the one in you and Dad's old picture.
You're not crazy, Yang. That was your mom, all right. Let me guess. She didn't say a word, did she?
How did you know that?
I don't see my sister very often, but she does try to keep in touch, whenever it suits her.
But probably the most confusing statement they chose to add was a message she wanted to pass down to Yang.
She wanted me to tell you that she saved you once, but you shouldn't expect that kindness again. Raven's got an interesting way of looking at the world that I don't particularly agree with, and she's dangerous.
This singular message was quite the curious addition. For the first time, that statement is filled with hostility and anger, one that had yet to be expressed by either Yang nor Raven till now. And most confusingly of all, it hardly makes sense to begin with. The implication is that Raven knew Yang was in trouble and she had some sort of moral code she plays by to save a given person at least one time. It comes off less as something Raven does as part of her character, instead more like Spider-Man from an episode of Family Guy.
Wow, thanks, Spider-Man.
Everybody gets one. Tell him, Peter.
Apparently everybody gets one.
Bingo.
While this was a questionable insert, by the end of the volume, it almost manages to save itself entirely. Despite what felt like a cold and heartless message to leave behind, when Yang's arm is later cut off by Adam and she sits in her room depressed, Raven can't help but check on her well-being, making sure she's alright, all things considered. By having the cold statement earlier in the volume, which made it feel like she didn't care about her daughter, being contrasted with this scene was almost perfect. Her words say one thing, but her actions show that she's worried. But despite doing this, it's almost as though the writers had no idea the beauty of what they had just done. If only they knew what they did. Yet again, what serves as a clear divide in the story and quality of the series as a whole would be Volume 4 and on. The question was, where were they going to move the character of Raven? The more subtle nuances they had given her for the past 3 volumes, or would they take that nugget of cold, heartless dialogue and run with it? From a character we'd seen spying on her daughter she abandoned long ago, as well as stepping in to save her life, what happened to Raven Branwen after Volume 3? The Maidens were such a large and unavoidable addition to the world of Remnant. Not only were they powerful warriors of the elements, but they were also the keys used to unlock the doors to the relics. Their role became pivotal and essential for the plot to continue. So the question was, who were they gonna pick to be the Maidens? They couldn't just be any random nobody for long. A Maiden would always have to have a presence during the volume. You couldn't just have a character waltz into the story, open the relic's gate, and vanish into the wind. No. They either had to be someone we already knew or someone the series wants to get us attached to fast. Insert Raven. If she was obviously going to play a role into the story already, why not kill two birds with one stone? By making Raven a Maiden, her story was on an inevitable collision course with her daughter. No matter what, no matter when, no matter the circumstance of the story, because Yang is one of the main characters, her and Raven's paths would cross. And cross they would. While her true identity as a Maiden would stay hidden for the majority of volumes 4 and 5, it seems they had a clear idea of how they wanted to treat her as a Maiden, but not as a mother. What may seem like the obvious and simple solution to this problem by having her abandon her daughter because of her powers, this was in fact not the real solution to the dual role she served in the story. What wound up happening wasn't to figure out how to treat her as a mother, but instead, abandon it altogether. And so Volume 4 comes around, and we finally get to see Raven as the character they wanted to start portraying her as. A scowl plastered across her face, an attitude as though she permanently woke up on the wrong side of the bed, Crow sits there and berates her as a mother who doesn't care.
It's just obnoxious that you'd bring up family and then carry on like your own daughter doesn't exist.
I saved her.
Once, because that was your rule, right? Real Mom of the Year material, sis.
All with a bad attitude emanating from Raven herself. What begins to become a frequent occurrence from this point on are other characters' negative outlook towards her shaping the general perception of who she is. Something I mind you the show hasn't been doing up until now. As I mentioned earlier, anytime Yang previously spoke of her, it didn't give off animosity. The emotions being expressed were sadness and curiosity. It made the audience feel sad for Yang, but equally curious on her quest to find the truth. But on Raven's first official debut, there's a very clear and noticeable venom emanating from her and the way Crow speaks to her. And if you already know how the story plays out, it's obvious as to why. Raven was set to become an antagonist. Too many concepts were working against her that it made it impossible for her to be anything but. Unless the Maiden is working directly with the main characters, the only other role they can fulfill in the story is being against them. And Raven couldn't simply work alongside the characters because she had abandoned Yang as a child. Raven had a storyline that had yet to be given a resolution and a role that couldn't ignore being involved. She was backed into a corner, or as the writers would presume, fell perfectly into the role of an antagonist. I mean, how could a parent possibly abandon their child and still be seen as anything other than evil? So it became clear, Raven had to be unlikable. The audience had to turn on her. They had to make sure no one got any other ideas in their head over who exactly the character of Raven Branwen was. Except there's one key problem. You only get one chance at a first impression. And first impressions are vital. Volume 4 wasn't where the viewers formed their first impression of Raven. In fact, she'd been leaving impression after impression on us over time already. And their biggest mistake of all was that Volume 2 end credit scene, because what this scene represents goes against everything they wanted to do with her as a character after they turned her into a Maiden. The first real impression Raven left us with was not only saving her daughter's life, but also choosing to confront her instead of having Yang have to find her. She took the first step in their reunion and did it with a smile on her face. This was the first impression they gave us of Raven, and post-scene credit or not, it was in the actual show. It was put in, and whether they wanted to acknowledge it or retcon it in the future, the damage was already done. this was where you chose to give us a first impression of Raven. It was included for a reason, with the intention of being used as a kicking off point. And it couldn't be in more stark contrast, because after the idea for the Maidens had come up with after this volume had ended, they wanted to take her in the exact opposite direction.
I want my brother dead. Sometimes family disappoints you like that. I've stared death in the face over and over again, and every time I've spat in that face and survived because I'm strong enough to do what others won't.
And where did it all lead? A character now inflicted with self-importance, always looking down on others. What was it they chose to do with her story? How do you balance the act of being a maiden alongside with addressing her story with Yang? Simple answer: don't do one of them. You see, Volume 4 faced a very big problem in the eyes of the audience. It was slow, boring, and viewers began to see just how messy and clumsy of a narrative RWBY was starting to become, especially since all 4 of the main girls were separated off on their own mini adventures. The show just didn't feel the same, especially with how they managed to pull off such a successful Volume 3. People wanted to see everyone back together, just like the good old days of Beacon. So when it came to Volume 5, a fork in the road was reached. Either the writers can work to start reuniting the girls, tying up their stories, or keep things slowed down, allowing a little more time to go into each storyline at the behest of some fans. Well, when it came down to it, the decision was reached to begin bringing everyone back together. Every storyline must now all start to converge to the same location. This was a creative decision which came at a detrimental cost to Raven's character. Due to the single decision, Raven's story was forced to get cut short. No, not her Maiden storyline, as that had to continue to be relevant, but her story with Yang. In what was a 4-year-long character motivation for Yang seeking to understand the reason her mother left and abandoned her, was all thrown away in Volume 5, Episode 4, Lighting the Fire. After setting out on a new journey, Yang seeks once more to find her mother, only this time succeeding. At this point, you'd almost expect there to be a moment of disbelief, shock, or fear of the unknown. This is what she's been curious about her entire life. But in a single moment, everything gets thrown away and tossed to the side with the words, "I'm not here for you."
I'm not here for you. Ruby is somewhere in Mistral. She's with Crow and she's going to need my help. I just need you to take me to her.
What was Yang's single most influential motivator in life was swept under the rug the moment her mother came on screen because the show was too slow and she needed to be reunited with her team as soon as possible. What was undeniably a question that would answer so much about her and who she is, Raven's whole backstory and ultimate decision for why she chose to leave her daughter is left hanging in the air. And worst of all, it was only her who suffered from this decision. Every other character's storyline could one way or another be entwined with each other. The effort to save Haven was where the majority of characters were. Weiss had already run away from home, and the Faunus storyline was just lumped into taking place at Haven as well. Yang couldn't reunite with everyone and stay with Raven. Well, she could have, but they chose not to take it. Weiss was at the camp as well during this time, but in reality, she served no real purpose and could have safely been flown to Mistral without affecting anything. 3 out of the 4 characters had a way of meeting up again in a convenient but more or less natural way. But it seems they didn't want to reunite 3 of the 4. They needed all of them, and so they had to abandon the story of Raven being a mother, which also greatly hampered Yang as well. What initially seems like Yang recognizing who her real family is in RWBY only works under the pretext that she valued and ever considered staying with Raven to begin with. But yet again, as I keep bringing up, because the writers want to paint her as an antagonist, Yang enters the scene incredibly combative and hostile towards her for no reason at all.
Save your breath. You could spout off whatever you want, but nothing is going to keep me from my sister.
Well, aren't you stubborn?
I get it from my mom.
Raven offers her food and a place to stay, but Yang is having none of it, as though holding resentment for having left her all those years ago, pretending as though Raven has been luring her in with promises of a home life and being reunited, and being fed up with it. That sad curiosity is replaced with anger she's never shown about this. Multiple times, Raven brings up the fact that she's willing to talk about whatever she wants.
So any questions you have, I'll be happy to answer.
But Yang brushes it off as though she'd moved on. And that may very well be so, but even from a storytelling perspective, that's not how you pay off an entire character's sole motivation. This is what had been driving her since her trailer. Questions beget answers. And it's these answers which should have raised Raven up. But instead, the dreadful decision was made to abandon it altogether. She needed to be torn down lower than Yang. They didn't have time to deal with this plotline and the fact that she was a maiden. So instead, the writers saved themselves some time by cutting it all together. It's made even more curious as the two would meet again later on. Raven's story did lead to Haven, where all of the characters already were. So to have Yang leave the camp only to later be reunited was a curious case of planning, to say the least. The later end of the volume would only make things that much worse for Raven, placing her literally on the side of the antagonists, only to later fight off Cinder as well. You talk about a character who the writers have no idea what to do with. It's her. Because she stood shoulder to shoulder with those who are literally the evil characters, you associate her as being one of them, holding the same values as they do. It doesn't matter that she fought against them later and then proceeded to not fight against Yang, because the picture had already been painted. Raven needs to be seen in the wrong. And worst and most atrociously of all was when Yang calls her a coward for her fear and unwillingness to face off against Salem. A reoccurring characteristic Yang as condemning those she hardly knows anything about. Volume 5 frequently and consistently painted Raven as nothing more than a coward. But what's failed to be established to make this an effective point is yet again Raven's past. There's this underlying implication that Raven has encountered Salem before, and she knows what she's capable of. And it's because of that past she fears her in modern day. I'm not denying that Raven fears Salem, but to label her a coward? That's a statement born from ignorance. Raven fears Salem because she knows. Yang is brave because she doesn't. The protagonist's assured nature can simply be questioned by asking the question, is it confidence that drives you, or ignorance? They didn't know anything about Salem or what she was capable of, and yet they pretend as though they are veterans who have experienced everything and nothing could possibly stop them. Yang's whole perspective about her has been formed by her father and his descriptions of her. A fact the scene itself calls direct attention to.
You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through, the choices I've had to make.
You're right. I don't know you. I only know the Raven Dad told me about. She was troubled and complicated, but she fought for what she believed in, whether it was her team or her tribe.
But mere sentences after saying how she knows nothing about her, she proceeds to act as though she's known her entire life.
Oh, shut up! You don't know the first thing about strength. You turn your back on people. You run away when things get too hard. You put others in harm's way instead of yourself. You might be powerful, but that doesn't make you strong.
Such a contradiction only sets Raven up to fail as a sympathetic character. The scene plays out to feel as though Yang is finally standing up for herself and telling off the mother who has done nothing but tear her down. But that's never what she did. Whatever anger the writers think Yang has isn't there because of Raven's doing. Perhaps an interesting enough psychological study of Yang creating her own mental image of her mother, coming up with reasons that could possibly explain to herself why she chose to abandon her. But the truth is, Yang doesn't know, and she never makes the attempt to know. Raven's torn down only to push Yang higher. It seems everyone has already formed their opinion on Raven, without hearing what she has to say about anything. Before we go any further, I just wanted to make one thing clear. While I've spent a lot of time so far speaking of the evolution and direction of her character, that's quite frankly not where the problem lies. It was important for you to see how certain plot points played out, but the nature of who she is from Volume 4 onward is definitely my preferred nature of her. In fact, Raven's bad attitude is what I think draws most people to her, me included. And it's precisely this addition of her acting this way which in turn made her incredibly complex. Because now the two evolutions of her character are clashing and entwining. The more caring past and the prideful future interweave almost accidentally perfect. Looking at both iterations, I don't think either one of them is all too interesting or complex versus the other. But it's because she got pulled in both directions that we have the video you're watching now. So just letting you know, Raven's bad attitude is one of her most endearing features for viewers and is not the problem here. In fact, I hope it never goes away. It's only when the show chooses to highlight this version of who she is and ignore the other that the problem arises. And to bring up more evidence just to show how misunderstood she actually is, look no further than her semblance. I would bring up how I think Raven's semblance is perfectly catered towards the type of person she is, giving off this aura of a lone wolf, always on the move, never getting attached or too afraid to get attached to anyone or anything, giving the ability to teleport only to those she has formed a deep connection with. A power the user never wants to use, or realistically, can almost never use. In a way, it's beautifully poetic, but in the world of RWBY, that's not how semblances work. They aren't a random spin of the roulette wheel by the gods, they're not the opposite of who gets them. They are a representation of who they are. They are, as everyone can recite by memory, the manifestation of one's soul. Raven's soul is tied to her forming deep connections because somewhere within her, that is her. Perhaps it manifested when her and Crow were children in the bandit camp, and they only trusted and could rely on each other, which would innately create a deep bond. I don't know. But similarly, this aspect of who she is refuses to be acknowledged by the characters or the audience. If Raven truly didn't care about anyone, she wouldn't have the semblance she does now. And it's most curious in the case of Yang. She learns of her semblance by Tai in Volume 4.
Dad told me how your semblance works. You could bond to certain people. And when you do, you could create a portal that takes you straight to them. You've got one for Dad, one for me, and you've got one for Crow.
Yet after learning her mother considers there a deep bond between the two, she never questions why. Why do you have a deep connection with a baby you abandoned almost immediately after birth? There was no time to bond. There was no time to form feelings. So why does this bond exist? From Yang's perspective, it shouldn't make any sense. But for Raven, it was different. It was just done from afar. Abandoning Yang's search for answers was the single greatest mistake to happen to her character. And doubly, it almost completely destroyed another. The key word there is almost. Not all hope is lost just yet. Yes, while plenty of opportunities have been missed, the character of Raven still has a chance to be taken in the right direction, making the best of a bad situation. While the writers and directors had chosen not to take the route of a caring but flawed individual, they still did leave us with an incredibly flawed character. The Raven we currently have is not a character free of fault, nor am I acting as though everything she's ever done is justified. The character she is in modern day is plagued by pride. The unreasonable sense of self-importance, utter arrogance, and believing your way is the right way. Believing in only your own abilities and not in that of others, always looking down on them. Even the way they have her carry herself, her head is consistently tilted upward, forcing her to both figuratively and literally be looking down on everyone she speaks with. Pride is argued as the deadliest of all the sins as it gives birth to all the others. The Raven we've gotten to see the most of in the present is plagued with this. the mentality of the survival of the fittest, and even killing the previous Spring Maiden. She believes only in her own ability and judgments, thus she could not trust such powers with anyone who wasn't her. This is the character we have left to deal with, and it only becomes a real tragedy if they choose not to go anywhere with it or address it in any form, which is almost exactly what had been happening. Raven is full of pride, yes, and they will point that out at every given opportunity, at every action she's ever taken. But what's never addressed are all the times she's been anything but prideful. All of the times she's cared about someone other than herself. I want you to take a look at this clip from the end of Volume 5, Chapter 6, known by its song, and look deeper at what it is about Raven.
Yang. If you side with your uncle, I may not be as kind the next time we meet.
You weren't kind this time either.
I know.
At the very end, did you notice how she recognizes the person she is? She knows she's not a very motherly individual. The statement felt as though she wanted to, but just failed. And if you look back at the episode, it almost makes sense, as though she was kind of trying. On paper, she does a lot right, trying to be motherly, so to speak. She invites Yang and her friend into her tent, gives them tea, converses, and tries to bestow her past knowledge and experiences onto her daughter. On paper, it looks as though she's trying, but at the end of it all, Yang still hates her, and we get the statement of her recognizing she failed at being kind. Fundamentally, it doesn't seem in her nature to be the traditional mother figure, and she shouldn't. She grew up in this camp and had a rough upbringing that shouldn't produce someone to have a very warm presence. You can see the difference in lifestyle on both Yang and Raven from this statement alone. Raven considers what she did to be kind because in the world she's grown up in, that kind of hospitality isn't normal, while Yang thinks the opposite. She's grown up in a more traditional home where people around her love her. She's used to this kind of thing. They're from such different walks of life, and yet while Raven seems capable of recognizing she's not the type of mother Yang wants, Yang doesn't even think this is just the type of mother she is. It's against Raven's nature to wear her emotions on her sleeve, but she tries in her own ways. As Tai said, she's complicated, but it's almost as though Yang expected her to act like a normal mom. But yet again, the writers can start anew and do something good with the problem they created. Almost so accidentally poetically done, pride is not permanent. Raven just has to learn what is the exact opposite, and the exact opposite of pride is love. Love does not value oneself, but others instead. Whereas pride looks down as others being beneath you, love looks up, willing to raise someone above yourself and value them. This is the same love that is tied to her semblance, but is blocked out by the pride, which almost refuses to allow her to show it. Glimpses of her love and empathy are shown. Raven had a bond with Vernal, and after her death, she takes the effort to close her eyes. If Vernal were nothing but a stepping stone for the self-centered Raven people perceive her to be, she would have ignored Vernal altogether, not acknowledging what she did or the help she gave her.
Thank you, Vernal.
And as has been shown over and over again, she does care about her daughter. She saved her life. She watched over her after she lost her arm. And if your argument is that she'd saved Yang's life once, just think, was that a rule Yang was ever aware of? Was that some kind of moral code she's been holding on to, following her daughter's entire life, just waiting to save her life once so she could forget about her? Or was it a mother saving her daughter's life, but being unable to acknowledge the fact that she cares? Her pride refuses to allow her to show emotion, so that's why she said it was the reason she saved her life. If Raven doesn't care, why does she watch over Yang when she's recovering? Yes, clearly it would have been more impactful if she were there to nurture her directly as a mother would do, but yet again think about the perspective of Raven. Was she supposed to just walk into her room and say, "Hey, sorry I've been gone your entire life, but now I'm here to help you deal with your arm"? Not once does anyone humor the perspective of Raven as well. When is the right time to walk back into your daughter's life? She did it in Volume 2, but she was a much different character back then. So how does someone full of pride show that they care? In more unorthodox and unconventional ways. She warns Yang at almost every given opportunity not to fight Salem because she believes it's a suicide mission and she doesn't want to see her daughter die. Yet somehow, the main focus of this message is that Raven is too cowardice for a cause she believes is unwinnable. The simple and clear message that she doesn't want to see her daughter killed in a frivolous effort is lost on Yang and the viewers. But it's quite simple as to the sole reason why. No one in the show defends her. Everything could have been avoided if one of the characters said something to vouch for anything. And in reality, the only two who could have done this were Crow and Tai Yang, specifically Tai. But he fell victim not due to the type of character he is, but due to the structure of the story and how it's told. Tai talks to Yang about Raven before Yang has been able to meet her. Thus, the script does not allow him to detail specifics. Raven at this point in the story is still a mystery, one of which they don't want to speak of her life story before we've gotten a real chance to see her. Because of this, the script is forced to be vague. Tai is trying to give Yang a picture of who her mother is, while also trying to not spoil or detail anything specific for the sake of the audience. Of anyone, Tai seems like the one who would understand Raven, and well so. They were married, they had a child. He should understand her actions. If the sequence of events happened in a different order, I'm sure it would have turned out much differently. If Yang had met Raven and then went back to Tai where he could talk about her, he wouldn't have to step on eggshells. But it's because that character doesn't exist, Raven feels so isolated and misunderstood. It's because the outlook on her went from sad and curious to hostile and heartless. She found herself the victim of a transition phase and new over-ambitious ideas. And worst of all for her, at the end of Volume 5, she's drawn to tears over her conversation with her daughter. A prideful individual does not shed tears for others. The emotions she's been restraining overwhelm her to the point of breaking down, in likely the one person she didn't want to see her do it. And she's forced to leave, alone, with no one to go back to. Something she's been pushing for, but not really what she wanted. Raven is in this constant struggle of trying only to rely on herself, but being incapable of forgetting those that she cares about. No one knows what she's doing other than herself. She's practically torturing herself. She followed Yang's life, but Yang didn't know about it. No one knows what she's doing other than herself. And by the end of everything, out of all the characters who have tried to push others away and failed because others were willing to stand by them through their roughest patches, Raven succeeded, and no one's there to pull her back. In a way, Team Stark is the perfect example of a failed team. One of their own died, they split up, and those who are still alive are distant from each other, resentful, not wanting to see each other, not being there for the others who need it. Raven's redemption, as many will see it, should not stem from her seeking to be redeemed. It does not come from apologizing to everyone she has wronged and acting as though she was the sole problem. She has a lot to feel sorry for, what she did and what she became, but so do the others, not saving her from herself. It all just leaves you asking the question, where did this come from? A failure of the writers, overambitious ideas, or the death of the visionary? It's foolish to believe the Raven we know now is the Raven that has always existed. A prideful individual never would have gone to Beacon. They never would have become part of a team, and they certainly would never have had a child. Who Raven was prior to modern day is almost as much of a mystery as what happened to Summer. What event or series of events turns a woman who's happy to be part of a team to someone only comfortable in trusting themselves? A past which shaped a once proud huntsman into someone no one, not her team or even herself, understands.